friends. Welcome to episode 204 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian in my 16th year, I knew I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that all the ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast by myself, my interview guests, and listeners who reach out to the podcast are our own and do not reflect those of our school districts. When incorporating research, I always make sure to cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. I'd like to extend a very special welcome this week to the many school librarians I engaged with on Library Twitter this week. At least twice in the past couple days, #Librarians was trending on Twitter, and I have the screenshots to prove it. Friends, if you were thinking that Library Twitter was going to disappear, well, think again. I am invested in maintaining this community, this valuable PLN that I happen to have on Twitter, and as evidenced by this week, I don't think it's going away anytime soon. I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback and episode suggestions. You can reach me either on Facebook, on Twitter. My handle is @LMS_United, or the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I'll be sure to send you a podcast sticker. And now a word from our official sponsor, Capstone. Capstone is an innovative publisher and education technology provider of children's content for school libraries, classrooms, and at-home learning. Home of the award-winning PebbleGo research database, Capstone has a passion for creating inspired learning and intellectual curiosity in children, and I am so excited to be working with them. And now in a segment I like to call Why I Love Capstone. Friends, I make no secret of the fact that I started off my career as a history teacher, and it does resonate with me. It is something that I continue to feel passionately about. I got to teach some research skills to my 12th graders who are doing their history research, and I felt so at home. But I'll tell you what, today we are talking about a really cool series by Capstone, which was published in 2022 and also 2023. We've got 6 books in this series called Fact versus Fiction in U.S. History. And these are fantastic titles. And not only is it a wonderful opportunity to support areas of the curriculum in your school, but also introduce information literacy to your older students. This would be grades 8 to 11 years old. So reading from the website, Christopher Columbus and the Americas, Separating Fact from Fiction. In 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas, or did he? Look at the facts and discover the fiction through primary sources, infographics, and leveled text. Readers will learn the full story about Christopher Columbus's famous voyage. Another title in this series, and I can imagine this would be fantastic with supporting some of these holiday celebrations, and it is called The First Thanksgiving, Separating Fact from Fiction. Every November, the United States celebrates Thanksgiving Day. But what really actually happened at the first Thanksgiving, and did it really happen? Discover the facts and find out the fiction surrounding one of America's most celebrated holidays. The other 4 titles in this series include Benjamin Franklin and the Discovery of Electricity, the Lewis and Clark Expedition, as well as Sutter's Mill and the California Gold Rush, Thomas Edison, and the invention of the light bulb. As with all series from Capstone, I strongly advise that once you make this investment, that you keep these together in a set, display them together, and book talk them together, because I imagine once students get a chance to take a look at these, they're going to want to read more of them, and wait and see what happens when your teachers find out these exist, because I imagine the entire set is going to get circulated in the classrooms as well. I am so grateful to Capstone for their continued commitment to support the podcast in Season 5. They are offering listeners of School Librarians a very special discount. Visit shop.capstonepub.com and use the code UNITED to get $20 off an order of $100 or more for both print and Capstone interactive ebooks. That's code UNITED for $20 off an order of $100 or more for both print and ebooks on shop.capstonepub.com. And now for our episode supporting literacy and well-being, and my conversation with Dr. Margaret Merga. Dr. Merga, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Amy. It's great to have the opportunity to speak with your audience. Friends, I am so excited to be having this conversation. And I'll tell you what, I have wanted to invite Dr. Merga on the podcast for at least half a year now. And I'll be honest, when you're recording with somebody who's halfway around the world, and in tomorrow, by the way, it does take a little bit of finesse and a lot of cooperation on my guest's part. So, friends, this is the part of the episode where I ask the guest to describe their library. Dr. Merga, would you give us an idea of where in the world you work and what connects you to the wonderful world of school librarianship?
Sure. And really sadly, I don't have a library. I really wish that I did. I am a former academic researcher who still does academic research as an adjunct at the University of Newcastle in New South Wales. But I also run Merga Consulting. And basically what I do is write books about libraries, literacy, wellbeing, that kind of thing. And I also work with schools, professional organisations and the like around solving their issues that they have around literacy and libraries, trying to come up with research-informed solutions for them. I do some keynotes. I do some kind of motivational seminars for their parents where schools are trying to really encourage parents to become more active and involved in their students' literacy in the home. So there's a real variety in what I do. I also sometimes consult for government departments around literacy policy. Recently worked for the Department of Education in New South Wales around information literacy policy. So it's a really wide and diverse range of things I do, but I've done a lot of background research and put out a lot of peer-reviewed literature that can enable me to come into these spaces and offer some degree of expertise. And it means my life is very dynamic and interesting, and I get to really indulge my passions, which are libraries, literacy and learning, really.
Well, and it sounds like a lot of different groups are taking advantage of your expertise. But I learned something curious about you. You've worked in the U.S. before.
Many years ago, when I was young, back in the olden days, I did have a brief stint in the US where I started out, once I finished my first degree, went to the US for a while because my father is a former New Yorker, and, went over to stay with my gran for a while. Then I did a literacy internship role in Philadelphia, which was really eye-opening. I don't think I really understood the differences and the similarities between the Australian and the US education system until I was, in that role, and it was the inner city Philly school, and already, those issues, those differences around, being asked to take out mandatory homicide insurance, things like that. It's just not something that would happen in the US. But I also learned a lot, and I had a really wonderful partner teacher at that time. And I, felt really hopeful about a lot of the elements of US education that we're seeing. But that was quite a long time ago, but still a great experience.
Well, and friends, we're going to have a lot of opportunities to ask Dr. Merga about the important trends which are happening in Australia right now. And I'm so grateful that you're here. Friends, in doing my digging on the internet, I discovered that Dr. Merga has been published at least 123 times. This conversation is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Dr. Merga's extensive research and writing when it comes to literacy and how school librarianship are interwoven. Friends, this is no way to substitute reading the books that Dr. Merga has written and many of these articles. Dr. Merga, can I ask you right now, is there something in particular that you're working on that is really exciting?
Sure, and that's a great question. I love talking what I'm working on about right now because I, usually talking about something I did, last year or the year before. Just recently, I put together a paper about how school libraries could really act strongly as health literacy advocates. So as part of my weird and wonderful background, I have actually worked in health promotion research. And it was interesting to see all of these kind of past background elements of my professional life coming together and kind of coalescing because I got really excited at the possibilities and potential for, school libraries to really lead students' growth in health literacy because it's so important. And it's literally something that can affect the physical and mental well-being of our students. And in our current time that we're living in at the moment, with the pandemic still very much weighing upon us and affecting our young people, it's really important that we think about how we can best kind of nurture those aspects of our young people's wellbeing going forward. And we really underestimate the school library professional and what they do. I mean, there's already such a great alignment between the information literacy expertise that school library professionals have and what young people need in order to understand health literacy information that they encounter online. There's a lot of risk when they move into social media spaces and they're seeing fad diets promoted, they're seeing weird and wonderful, recommendations for their health that can in fact be really damaging. We've had TikTok trends that resulted in the death of young people. So it's really important that, young people are able to move into spaces where health messages are being promoted to them, that they can, interpret, understand and make safe choices around. And school library professionals are really well equipped to help young people in that regard.
Wow. I guess I'm curious. At what age do you recommend, and I realize a lot of this has to do with building those important relationships, those trusting relationships that school librarians can oftentimes have with our students who are frequent flyers to our spaces, those who come to and visit and stay in our spaces for extended periods of time. But, at what age would you recommend starting to integrate some of the concerns that you've been mentioning with the students that we're working with?
And this is where we have to be realistic. If we're aware that our young people are moving into digital spaces for school, and this is preschool age I'm talking here, then we need to be ready from a very early age to help them to negotiate those spaces. There's no point waiting till the damage has already been done. Young people are really influential, but also influencers are well equipped to really weigh and manipulate how young people perceive different things. So for things like, vaccinations and issues like that, I mean, where young people are really struggling to come up with decisions around that will protect themselves and also protect their families, it's really crucial that they be given accurate information that's actually evidence-based rather than, the latest stunning influencers' take on something. So, they're being hit by very powerful external influencers who may be very wealthy, very attractive, use the right fashionable music and really know how to lean into their personal interests. So we have to really show young people how to take that critical eye to these sorts of things and then understand that they're being manipulated and exactly how that's happening. Look, here are the tricks of the trade. This is how this person is attempting to influence you, but let's take a closer look. What is their credibility? What is their background knowledge? And understand how that happens, because they're the ones on the receiving end from a very early age.
I don't know exactly when it happened, but I know that there was a phase in social media when especially on Instagram, there was this idea that are, the filters were giving people on the other side of the screen such an artificial understanding of what this person truly looked like. And many of these influencers on, especially, social media would choose not to use a filter to be more authentic with their consumers, with the people who are watching the content that they're generating. I also think that librarians are really well suited to build up our collection in such a way that the counter message to so much of this negativity that our students might be encountering on social media. I think when we build up our collection with books that encourage and model some characters and stories who respond to negativity with wonderful, sort of affirmations. And I think about how many students feel, I'm just talking about something as sensitive as weight. And you can find amazing books on our shelves. I know that really do foster a sense of pride and allow our students to sort of push back against some of that overwhelming messaging that they might be getting on social media.
Absolutely, and I feel like both fiction and non-fiction collections could really offer a lot in that space. when I was interviewing teacher librarians about, how they seek to influence young people's well-being, they didn't just talk about making informational texts available. They also talked a lot about, choosing those powerful fiction texts, but also making sure they got into the hands of teachers as well as students, so that teachers in the classroom could really make great use of those texts and, really enable students to have those rich learning experiences where they would connect on an emotional level as well as an intellectual with a text. But just going back briefly to what you were saying about the filters, I just found that really interesting because it's one of those opportunities where the thing that causes harm can also cause benefit because, like you say, we've got also influencers who take the trend and flip it on its head, and you see that on platforms like TikTok as well, where the filters are stripped away, where women remove their makeup. And you see, the scarred skin beneath and things like that. The pores, women actually have pores, my goodness, these sorts of things. And so this is where, I feel like, absolutely, physical collection will play a powerful role. But even when we have students in our school libraries during class time, we can also use some of these great influences to counter. And there's some really positive ones out there who also tackle misinformation on platforms like TikTok in really powerful ways.
Well, and friends, I'm excited because Dr. Merga is definitely going to have to speak on the work that you've done using TikTok in your research. And so friends, we're going to build up to that. I promise we won't let Dr. Merga go without telling us how TikTok sort of played a role in some of the research that you were doing. Friends, I'd like to focus on a book of Dr. Merga's, School Libraries Supporting Literacy and Wellbeing, for today's conversation. And I'm incredibly grateful for your abbreviation glossary that you had in your book. And an RFP. An RFP is my all-time favorite, and I'll be honest, I have not used that abbreviation before, and it's now part of my lexicon. Reading for pleasure. Reading for pleasure is so, I think oftentimes I default to independent reading. It's the independent reading. But independent reading doesn't do it justice, because at the heart of it is we're reading because this gives us joy.
Absolutely. And I actually stole RFP from an amazing research colleague in the UK, Professor Teresa Kremen. But exactly as you say, it's not just about reading that we're doing, incidentally. It's not about reading for information. It's about reading for pleasure. And when we have that enjoyment in reading, that's when we're looking at stimulating our kind of capacity to keep doing it, to engage our frequency, and that we want our young people to choose reading as a leisure pursuit. If it's not something they enjoy, they're not going to select it over other competing interests. So, for example, first-person shooter gaming or any of the other things that young people get into, we need it to be able to compete. In order for it to be able to compete, we need to show that it's an activity that can actually be pleasurable, and there are a lot of different ways we can do that.
Oh, I would love to hear. What are some of the activities that you feel have been the most, meaningful and the most successful? Because it sounds like you've got some strong feelings about this.
Sure, I do. And actually, it's really interesting how I got into this area, because back when I was a teenager, one of my first jobs was as a tutor of some of my younger peers. And they weren't engaged readers, and I wanted to keep making money. So I wanted to raise their English grades so that I could keep making money. So I wasn't trained or anything. I was 16 years old, still in high school myself. I thought to myself, well, why was I good at English language arts? That's what you folks call it in the US, and we call it English here. It was kind of accidental because I became an early reader. And I understood that I wasn't necessarily a giant genius brain legend. I was fortunate in that I had my reading fostered. So I got my students reading. I listened to their interests. I modeled really keen reading behaviors myself, and they became readers, and their grades went up, and their parents paid me money. It was great for me as a teenager. But that meant, later on when I came back to do my PhD, I was really interested in these social influences on young people's reading, because I do do feel like we give up quite quickly. We give up on boys. In particular, we assume it's, something that they're not socially meant to be or biologically meant to be for some reason, which flies in the face of the fact that we have many men who do love reading. We give up on children once they move through the early years of schooling and they can read by themselves. Once they have independent reading skills, we step back and we, say to ourselves, well, we've done what we came here to do. We've given them these foundational skills they need, and now, we'll just leave them to it. But unfortunately, having spoken with teenagers and older children, this actually communicates a message to them that reading is no longer important for them beyond those early years. Now, that's really problematic because literacy skills do not remain static over time. We know from the research that's come out of the US at looking at summer literacy slide that when we don't continue to practice these reading skills, we can actually slide back. So continuing to read and being a lifelong reader is really core to both maintaining and developing our literacy skills going forward. And even as an adult, I've spoken with educators at conferences and they've said, well, yes, actually, we stopped reading for pleasure and we were just occasionally reading professionally. And we actually noticed that when we came to kind of speaking or writing, it took us a little bit longer to find those words, to kind of tap into that vocabulary that were needed to really express ideas. And teenagers were saying the same thing. I remember speaking to one boy who had been a very keen reader and then became a very keen Call of Duty player. And he talked about how, now it took him a lot longer to come up with, what he wanted to say in class. And that also he recognised that he'd lost some of those strengths that he'd had before as a keen reader. So I found that very interesting.
Something I found, though, is that when our students stop reading, my concern is I'm working with our oldest students, and we were trying to pick out some independent reading, and consistently they were simply going to the shelves and finding the smallest, shortest book. And what was clearly lacking was stamina, was this ability to not just open a book, but stay reading and not be distracted by the device in their pockets, their AirPods in their ears. It was almost like it was asking too much for them to read a book that was more than a couple hundred pages long. They wouldn't touch them because this idea of having to read something that long seemed more like a chore than an opportunity.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of adults would be able to relate to that as well. Living in the environment that we are, constantly being responsive to the ping of our phone, notifications, our attention's so consistently diversified. That's the only thing that's consistent about it. And that means for those of us who are avid readers, the pleasure in reading these days is actually a lot to do with the immersion. It's about the escape, but also that ability to just apply that sustained attention and move out of the world into those spaces. Now, you're absolutely right. We've got so many young people that are really going to struggle with that because they've not necessarily ever had it. As us, who, if we've been readers, before, we know that that's there for us to come back to when we want to get that kind of sanctuary. But if young people have never really had an opportunity to develop that sustained attention, it is a big ask to expect them to pick up a big fat book and dive in with confidence, which is where reading aloud comes in as a really great thing that we can do with children beyond the early years. And I actually worked with local government here in the state of Western Australia a couple of years ago, developing the Never Stop Reading program. And this was really championed by the state premier's wife, who was a former primary school teacher. And, she was going out to school sharing my research that looked at the importance of continuing to read with young people beyond their early years. And there were these really cute videos of her reading with her gigantic son, reading out loud with him. And, it just really burst a lot of perceptions around when we should stop reading with children. I had a similar kind of moment when I was speaking at the behest of the Ministry of Culture in South Korea a couple of years back. And there was a woman in the audience who came and spoke to me afterwards and said, I stopped reading aloud to my son because, he could read by himself. So I felt like, I was supposed to stop. But having, listened to you, Margaret, and heard about the research, I'm going to go and read to him again because I realized it was something that he valued. it is about the literacy, absolutely, but it's also about the social connection, and it's also about building stamina. Reading aloud as a practice actually, offers such a range of benefits. It makes that bridge between, what young people can read independently and, what someone with a higher reading level can expose them to. Struggling readers really benefit from being exposed to reading aloud. And there's a fantastic study that was done in the UK a couple of years ago that looked at the massive gains of reading comprehension that were achieved when teachers read aloud in high school classrooms in the UK. Now, can you imagine how terrifying it was for those teachers in a high vigilance environment to read out loud to students, because reading aloud to students doesn't look like an educational activity, especially if you're not stopping every 2 seconds and asking about verbs and nouns and conjugation and whatever. If you make it something pleasurable, if you give it some fluency and fluidity and, build suspense and use expression, it looks like people are having fun. But they're also learning and making massive gains in reading comprehension that they wouldn't necessarily be able to make independently. And that's why it's so exciting and promising in terms of a practice that we should continue to use from elementary school right up to high school and beyond.
I can only speak to the high school where I work in and our ELA department, but I think that it is gaining more and more acceptance that reading during class time is a valued use of students' time. That if the students are spending time in class rather than direct instruction, that they are using that time to read, that it is still considered a very legitimate and worthwhile use of their academic time. And I think that that's gaining some momentum, because I think there was a time when the expectation was that if you had a reading assignment, the only place where that was, an acceptable use of their time was outside of the classroom. And I think that's gaining more and more popularity in the United States. So we are so, it is becoming so readily apparent that our students need to be able to build that stamina, and especially if they're going to be expected to continue reading and further their education.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like school library professionals also have an extra license to do it, you know what I mean? Because they're in that, literacy learning, that reading space. And I've had some really amazing stories kind of given to me by teacher librarians here where, they're perhaps in some cases been older women working with, year 9 boys, and they've thought to themselves, my goodness, this could end really badly. But then, they're begged to continue. And then when the students come to the next session, oh, miss, what were we up to? We need to get straight back into that. She would have so much fun with it by ending them on cliffhangers and then forcing them to leave and, really building that momentum and that passion. And we take for granted the problem that we have as educators, whether we're in the school library or outside the school library, is that most of us have literate backgrounds, rich literate backgrounds, where we've been exposed to reading probably from an early age. So we don't necessarily understand that our young people are often going home to environments that don't necessarily have a whole heap of books in them, that don't necessarily have parents who are willing or able to foster that reading engagement. Often the parents will have the best possible intention, but if you've got to work 4 jobs, it's just not going to happen. So this is why it's so important that, schools continue to sustain that responsibility for fostering that capability way beyond independent reading acquisition in students.
Friends, I could sit here all day and listen to Dr. Merga. Believe it or not, I read your book and I have some questions, and I'm so grateful that you're here, because this is the reason why we push record, friends. This is why Dr. Merga is here, and we're going to record this, because it's not enough for me to listen to this conversation. I'm so grateful that we get to share it. Very early in the book, page 27, you said, quote, "The bulk of the research in school library space is concentrated in the U.S. As an Australian, how has that impacted your ability to do research when you are using observations and studies which have been done abroad, specifically in the United States?"
So much fantastic research has been done in the US, which has been really helpful, but it's always extrapolation, of course, because you're outside the context. So that's why, in Australia and the UK and, other nations where we do have quite active school library communities, we're always trying to push to do research that also has that immediate contextual relevance and meets those local questions. But I've actually found myself, rather than replicating what's done in the US, in most cases when I've read the US research, I've thought to myself, but why is that? But how is that? Those kinds of qualitative questions coming out of the quantitative findings, and then have gone away and done research that more extends rather than replicates the US work. Though I have also done some quantitative work as well that kind of goes in a little bit of a different direction. For example, I did a paper with Dr. Saidi Matroni that looked at whether or not young people viewed reading as important beyond the early years and how that actually impacted on their reading frequency. We've also looked at, the impact of different elements on reading frequency, and found that, attending a school library, having an opportunity to access a school library is an incredibly important factor that emerges from quantitative data. So I've taken a mixed methods approach to this, where the problem requires talking to humans. I love that. I love to get out there and do interviewing and, get to the nitty gritty, because I understand that I won't have the answers. I'm just going to be the researcher that needs to talk to the people on the ground who will know the answers better than I will. And then sometimes you just need to have numbers in order to argue advocacy. And then you go out and you collect those numbers, and then you've got those beautiful percentages that school leaders love so much these days in our neoliberal environments that we have in schools. So I understand that we need both, and my research has always kind of adopted a mixed methods approach to a lot of the problems, and it's something that I've gotten a lot of pleasure out of over the years, as you can probably tell when you read my work.
Well, and friends, I've got to imagine that for many people, the research that you produce and the results which you can draw from your studies, those kinds of things are what decision makers and individuals in government positions can identify with. If you can produce numbers, if you can produce studies which qualitatively and quantitatively substantiate something that you want to see happen in the schools, rather than I call it anecdata. I'm sure there are other people in the world who use the word anecdata, but my anecdata will drive a lot of what I think is best practice based on just what I happen to encounter with the people I interview, with what I see and the people that I admire and all the wonderful things that they do. I can draw upon their best practice. But that doesn't mean a lot to a government official who's going to allocate research funds or is going to allocate monies to instigate programs around the country.
Sure, but I still need your anecdote. And when I go to my keynotes and I present, afterwards I shut up as much as possible and open my giant winnowing ears and try to listen, because that anecdata is going to show me the next direction for my inquiry and my research. I actually need to know what's happening in the ground. I'm not in your library, but I need to know what you're doing. I've heard so many exciting things. And the questions also I get asked after a keynote or a professional development seminar send me off. I love it when I get a question I can't answer. And I'm like, I will have to come back to you on that one. And sometimes it involves actually, having to conduct a research study in order to come to solutions. Other times it's just a matter of getting my hands on the right papers and then, getting back to the person afterwards. But I find it incredibly stimulating space because school library professionals are amazing, inquiring beings. They're very creative in their solutions. They understand the importance of rigorous data to inform the decisions they're making, but they're not limited by what we've done before. They're willing to take risks, informed risks, and they're also incredibly generous, and they share their findings and solutions with others. And that's why it's so great to be part of this community.
Well, and you are in good company, because I don't think there's a day that goes by in now the 16 years that I've been a school librarian where I have on the spot had to learn as I go. And my students see that, and they see that it's okay for the librarian not to know everything. It's not some earth-shattering sign of weakness or an embarrassment. Rather, this is an opportunity to demonstrate active learning and what we do so that we can fill those gaps in our knowledge. And again, happens to me daily. It's okay. I've gotten over it. And I'm fine being the person who learns and has the kids realize, oh, we're lifelong learners. We espouse that. That is part of who we are. I appreciate your decision to use the term school library professional, and I can readily identify with the challenge of the array of titles. And for you in this book, it's Table 6, which demonstrated the many competing and nuanced titles for our profession that we use here in the United States.
And it's not just in the US, it's also very much in the UK. We've got the most commonality in title choice in Australia, where mostly we're teacher librarians. But in the UK and the US, yeah, as you say, you could be anything. The titles are wild and wonderful. And I understand that in many cases, those titles have been selected to really reflect what that individual is doing, or perhaps seniority, or, perhaps they've listened to the buzzwords that their leaders like so much. And they've thought, oh, how can I incorporate those buzzwords in my title so that they can see me as, absolutely essential? But it becomes really problematic for researchers who are trying to keep an eye on the profession, but also school library facilities. So when you change the name of your library or your own name as part of a rebranding attempt to keep yourself above water, which I totally understand and can relate to, it does become really tricky in terms of those of us who are trying to see if the profession is in trouble. Are we expanding our numbers, or are our numbers contracting? We don't actually know if you've given yourself a title that's quite far removed from something that would be readily recognizable. And it also bothers me that we can't be more proud of what we are, and rather than seeking to just put a new name on it, just show, well, look, I've still got the same old name, but look at what I can do. We're spreading out into health literacy. We're listening to what the school community needs, and we're delivering what you need. We're not, just reflecting some kind of external idea about what is ideal. We talk to our students. We talk to our communities. We're a dynamic space that will welcome you no matter what you are, no matter, what kind of interest you have. We've got something for you in our library, rather than rebranding by just changing a name. I feel like it's better to be more effective in terms of advocacy and, have pride in the name, have pride in the school library, have pride in being a school library professional, whatever, we agree that's going to be called. I feel like that's important. And I understand it's such a vulnerability everywhere at the moment, with staffing cuts, with budget cuts, that it's scary, and, it's easy to jump on to a new fashion, but it's also risky in terms of the strength of the profession going forward.
Well, and I can speak to that concern, because as soon as you remove the word library, for many people, in their very limited understanding of the potential of what a space can be, if you take the word library out of the space, then the expectation of supporting a print collection goes out the window. And depending who your next administrator might be, if they don't perceive your primary focus as being promoting a culture of reading, of building literacy, which is getting to the next question, you complicate how people perceive the primary objective of your space. And if you're called a learning commons, all of a sudden, wait a minute, do you even need to build a print collection? You're not a library, you're a learning commons. And so this really does hit home. So I'm grateful that you recognize that is not just a challenge that we have here in the U.S. It sounds like there are some concerns also in Australia.
Absolutely. And, I've talked to teacher librarians who are talking about the books being shunted back into the kind of back area of the library, away from the learning space, that is really problematic. And the worst example of this is where our paper collection is entirely replaced by a digital collection. Now, that that completely flies in the face of the research. And I'm not talking about scanty research conducted on the back of a napkin. I'm talking about complex, detailed meta-analyses that have been done by multiple different people over time. I'm also talking about current research that's come out. I stay abreast of this space. My own research with 997 elementary school students found that young people still very much prefer to read in a paper book form. So when you remove the type of book that they like to read in the mode, then obviously that has the potential to impact on their, reading engagement. But more importantly, these meta-analyses that I talk about describe the difference in reading comprehension between paper and digital form. And at the moment, they are not the same. Schools need to understand that the way we read on the screens is not the same as the way we read on paper. And that is, comes through very strongly in the literature. So whatever, when I look at interviews with principals about these decisions, they say that they want to meet digital natives where they are, and they've decided that all young people prefer to read on screens, and they've decided it's the best thing for young people. Well, yeah, we do need to be able to read on screens, but whether or not we should be concentrating and pushing students to move on to screen reading all the time is another question, and the research at the moment suggests absolutely not.
Well, and friends, I know a lot of you are nodding your heads right now going, oh my God, absolutely, preach. Everything you're saying is really hitting home with this audience. The kids want to read a book that they can hold in their hands, that they can walk around, that they can show their friends, that they can be proud of. It's an accessory. It's an opportunity for them to show off to others the thing that they're reading right now, and it's an invitation to ask them, "What are you reading?" "Oh my gosh, that's a great book." "Oh, lovely." These are opportunities for us to engage with our students as readers, and we are robbed of that if what they are reading is in a device and tucked away. And sometimes because I know I'll go to somebody who's reading on a digital reader, and I'll say, I have to ask, what are you reading? And it's such an awkward question because I know they're reading, but I have no idea what you're reading. And it's so frustrating. I'm hoping that you'll share with us some of the challenges that you have encountered in building literacy in schools with libraries and library professionals, because we have such an important role that we can play. Do you feel in the research that you're doing that we are being utilized in a way that is most advantageous to our school community writ large?
It's such a great question, because if schools made good use of their libraries, a lot of these anxieties that they have around declining literacy performance would be arrested, because literacy performance would be enhanced. So it's cost effective for schools to make good use of you. And that's why when I'm talking with audiences that include school leaders, I always talk in these cost effective and neoliberal terms, because I know that it's important to them. But, if we don't invest in school libraries, that is going to be the biggest barrier to you being effective. So when your funding is cut, when your staffing is cut, when your resourcing is cut, these are cutting the legs off your capacity to serve your community, build their literacy, create safe spaces, sanctuaries for young people to withdraw from, challenging situations they're experiencing in the school environment. So that's why it's so important that school libraries be adequately resourced and by the right kinds of staff, with that good mix where you've got to have at least some qualified staff, and also, all your adjunct amazing staff with the strengths in the different areas where possible. It's also a really big issue that hasn't gone away, is that the educators and leaders outside the library still often have absolutely no idea what you do. And that's why a lot of them don't work with you. Talking to teacher librarians about their experiences here in Australia, sometimes I've had tears in my eyes, because it's always positioned as a failure of advocacy when the teacher librarian can't get the classroom-based teachers on site. Now, I have seen how hard some teacher librarians work, and I don't see that they are failing in the sense that they are letting the side down. They are trying absolutely everything, but they've got a leader who's hostile, or they've got, a culture that's so saturated by, meeting curriculum requirements that they don't, even though he's trying to build a bridge between what the library offers and how to meet those curriculum requirements, the teachers don't even have time to read his emails, let alone, engage with what he wants to do. So this is where I'm like, yes, we need to advocate. Advocacy is really important, but at the same time, if you're working incredibly hard to build that advocacy bridge and it's not working out, it's not necessarily just you're failing, okay? Don't be discouraged and keep trying. Try a different way, okay? You're doing your best, and don't give up, because I've seen amazingly talented teacher librarians absolutely languishing and rejected in their spaces. And that's one exciting thing about the school library community here. Next year, I'm going to be speaking in a state quite far away from where I am to a leadership community because the School Library Association of South Australia is organising that. They want to get the principals to come along, and they want the principals to listen to what I have to say about libraries and the importance of resourcing them, because they understand that it's really important that we meet that audience and that we also are responsive to the language and the priorities of that audience. So when you're seeking to make those connections with your leadership team and the classroom educators, coming at it from what you have to offer, if that lands on the ground, great. If those seeds start to grow, great. But often you'll have to really sit back, listen to them, and hear about what their priorities are and find ways to connect with those priorities. Those priorities might be completely alien to your own priorities. If you've got a leader who's only interested in sports, and promoting the amazing sporting performance of the school, they exist, then you need to think about, positioning it with him or her as being a space where, it could be a recovery space where these athletes have a downtime, by, reading, and that might offer some literacy benefits, which will improve, the school's literacy performance. But you might have to be a bit creative about how you position the library so that it's responsive to what their priorities are. Another thing that I find can be a little bit tricky is that there's often those of you who have been at this for a long time and not necessarily being respected in the role do get fatigued and do sometimes struggle to continue to articulate the breadth and depth of the contributions you're making in the school community. And you really do need to keep bombarding the school community with what you're doing in the parent newsletters, in the school newsletters, on the principal's desk. Just keep boring them with the same old, well, no, not the same old, but just constant energetic information about what the school library is doing, how it's meeting identified needs in the school community, and just maintaining it, because some leaders, I hate to say it, do have the attention span of a goldfish, probably because they're working so hard, so we do need to kind of take into account how often do we need to show a goldfish this information. Really, a lot of times. So just keep cracking away at it, and you'll get the you'll eventually embed in their head that they cannot live without you, that you are absolutely essential to them, and therefore they cannot afford to cut you. And, this is where I take my research and I translate it into plain English articles that you can find on the Conversation website. Now, these articles I've made have been translated into Japanese Newsweek. They got put in Japanese Newsweek. They've been translated into French, Indonesian, Arabic, you name it. So that I know they're getting out there into the world. And if you're listening to this in a country that has a non-English speaking population, there's a good chance you can find some Margaret Merga work in the native language, hopefully. And it will be translated from the Conversation, where I have taken complex research and really made it accessible. Now, these are the kinds of pieces, because they are Creative Commons licensed, that school library professionals often just take verbatim and paste into their newsletter, or just whack on the desk of their principal, knowing that it's going to be an easy read with strong research links that they can use for those purposes. So you can use that to build your advocacy when you're starting to feel tired. I'm going to just keep going on these barriers because I've got a lot to say about this.
Well, and friends, I'm going to say, friends, you can be sure we have a link in the show notes to the Conversation, which is this, repository of, I think 16 articles of Dr. Merga's, and you will see all of this passion on paper. If you want to get a sense, I bought your books, but I will say, if you want to get a flavor for Dr. Merga's writing, that we have a link in the show notes to 16 articles, which should give you a really good sense of the kinds of things that Dr. Merga has spent so much of your profession doing these deep dives. Dr. Merga talked about these schools that are so heavily invested in their sports teams, and I will say, episode 186 in July, I interviewed Jessica Fitzpatrick, and who received a mover and shaker designation because of her efforts to team up with athletes, and she created these amazing book clubs with the different sports, and they were reading these, motivational, sort of inspired books by athletes who were writing about their experiences, and you had these teenagers reading these, incredibly amazing stories written by professional athletes and sharing their experiences. So it is possible to tap that. And if you have an administrator who is so wrapped up in sports, well, go at this with I found another way to reach and motivate our athletes, and it involves a book club. And I'll tell you what, it's a fun listen. It's episode 186. I'll put the links in the show notes. I am fascinated by this concept of expired expectations and orphaned responsibility, especially when it comes to encouraging the love of reading in our students. And friends, I was hanging on every word. I was reading through this book, and I was just like, okay, I need to know more when you wrote these phrases I've never seen before, and yet it really got me thinking.
They arose out of those interviews I've done with children in upper elementary and lower high school. I guess that would be middle school years actually for you. In talking about, whether they were still identifying as readers beyond those early years of schooling, and, really talking about the kinds of social influences that they were experiencing, whether parents were still perceived as encouraging, whether teachers were still perceived encouraging, whether they felt they had a peer group that was supporting their reading, those kinds of things. So with expired expectations, it's basically that once young people had the ability to read independently, both teachers and parents were kind of seeing that as, okay, now, we've done what we need to do. So our expectations for the student have expired in terms of encouraging them to read. We will now step back. We've gone from learning to read to reading to learn, and we'll just trust them to keep doing it. And that's where it becomes an orphaned responsibility. So the parent might think, okay, well, the school will keep pushing that reading stuff. We've taught them to read, and we don't have to do that sitting down with them anymore at the end of a long, hard day and slogging through the reader. And the teacher might be thinking, well, we've got other stuff we need to do. The curriculum is absolutely full. We don't have time to sit around and foster reading for pleasure. We really have a lot to get done. And, that's no lie. They do have a lot to get done. But as we know, and what I actually have coming out next is a book that I've looked at, reading across the disciplines, and I look particularly at building a school literacy policy, and those skills that we get through independent reading are absolutely vital for learning and also articulating learning across all of the subject areas. So we need that strong command of reading comprehension to understand the math word problems. And this is where, if you're a math teacher and you're listening to this is where you've got a student from a non-English speaking background who performs amazingly well when we present them math problems that are purely in a numerical format. But as soon as we move to word problems, they're suddenly getting very low grades. Is the problem math, or is the problem literacy? Their literacy scores and their math scores are related, and actually there's a pile of research that shows relationship between those literacy scores and performance in science, math, you name it. So this is where these practices we have of continuing to encourage reading and, not subscribing to orphaned responsibility or expired expectations, pushing that encouragement and the continued value of reading beyond the early years is something that's needed to sustain performance, but also there has to be that underpinning principle that it's something we do for the purposes of pleasure. And that is essential because, unfortunately, a lot of schools are inadvertently communicating to young people that reading is something we do for the purposes of testing. And this drives me a little bit mad when I've interviewed young people and I've asked them, is your teacher a reader? Does your teacher like reading? And they said, I have no idea. I do not know if my teacher likes reading at all. no idea. And then I will ask the next question. Have you ever had a teacher who enjoyed reading? Oh, yes, there was Mr. this or Miss that. And I asked, well, how did you know that they liked reading? And they could always tell me, oh, it was this, it was that. They were always had their head in a book. They read to us so enthusiastically. You could see they enjoyed picking up the book when time came for us to read. But it seemed incredible to me that these were elementary school children, that they could be telling me that they had no idea if their teacher actually liked reading at all. And that when we talked about reading, they described it as something that could be done for the purposes of testing and testing only, not something that could afford pleasure. And that's why, when we're talking about encouraging the importance of reading, that we also be really also foregrounding that around the pleasures that can be afforded by reading.
I'm going to say right now, and you mentioned testing, but I'm going to mention testing in a slightly different context. When we go to our teachers and we say the kids need more time to be reading in school, during class time, most of the teachers that I've had these conversations with become very defensive. And they say, I'd love to read more in my class, but we have to get ready for this test. We have these state tests that we have to take. We have to take this state test. It's always this accountability piece. We're in testing season, and it is this dreaded time of the school year where all of a sudden the emphasis shifts from being in the classroom to being in a perpetual testing situation. And it goes on for weeks and weeks, now we're taking this test and now we're taking this test. And it robs our teachers of the true focus of what they should be doing. And that is digging into the content that they've been given, rather than preparing for some test, which is given every year for a way to hold schools accountable. And it really is such a waste of energy, in my opinion. Okay, so
I agree. Yeah, and it's a very narrowed construction of literacy that they're being exposed to. They get really good at setting tests, and they get, they improve their skills in a very narrowed skill field. And that's very problematic because, once they get out of school, no one's going to be interested in their ability to sit tests well. That's all behind them in the past. So, it's this basic thing, again, returning to where we need to advocate with those teachers, thinking about what does my audience need to hear? And this audience might need to hear that if we improve our students' reading through, giving them opportunities for sustained reading experiences, they're going to be able to read those test items more quickly and more accurately, which will then impact on the accuracy of their responses and also how much they're able to finish within the testing period, which obviously will then translate to higher grades. So this is the thing, it's understanding their priorities and showing how what you have to offer can meet those needs. It might take you a while to persuade them, but really if you just get a chance, and I've worked with schools that have said, right, we want to implement an intervention, because we need to show that there's a point to having this reading culture. So we're going to have to measure both students' attitude and attainment at the beginning, at the end. And I've, travelled interstate, sat down with them, come up with, great measures, ways of looking at both qualitative and quantitative data collection so that they can have this accountability. I understand you can't ask for these shifts without, also placing a bit of pressure on yourself and saying, and we'll need to see change. And this is where, you need to also understand how quickly you can expect to see change across different measures. You will see an attitudinal change before you will see a change in performance in most cases. So if you've only got a short time frame, say like 3 or 6 months, better to just stick to measuring attitudinal changes because you could relate them back to performance changes down the track. So, yeah, you just need to understand that accountabilities that we live in are tough. And you've also got a heck of a lot on your plate. I know that just as Australian teacher librarians and UK school librarians are, overwhelmed with the diversity of their workloads. And I've done analyses of their job description documents. So I really know what I'm talking about in that area. But also US school library professionals are also overwhelmed and also facing ongoing job or role creep where you're just continually having additional aspects added to your role. So I'm really careful when I suggest that you do anything, because I know I'm adding a straw to the camel's back, and I don't want to be the one that, leads to the camel no longer being able to function because the school needs you, camel.
Exactly. I was curious, in Chapter 3, Librarians Supporting Struggling Literacy Learners Beyond the Early Years, I saw you use the word struggling, and at least here in the context of talking to a bunch of librarians, I know there's been an effort to replace the word struggling with something a little more nuanced. And I think so. I think it's a bold choice to use the word struggling, because that really is at the heart of what we're getting at, that we're trying to support our students who are struggling. And yet, to call it what it is, at the risk of offending somebody, I know that there's been efforts here, especially in the U.S., to try and use words like emerging readers or dormant readers. Or so do you want to talk a little bit about because clearly you probably heard some of these conversations. You probably are aware of the push to move beyond something like struggling.
Absolutely, and that's why, as you say, when I added the word struggling to my book, I also added a very clear disclaimer and engaged with the research in this space to show that it was a carefully considered choice. Firstly, at the end of the day, on a pragmatic level, whatever you call it, students know what it is. So whether you call it the elephant readers or the purple readers or whatever, students know what it is. So, and struggle is not necessarily a bad word at all. I mean, I have been a struggling learner myself. I'm going to come out and tell you that I didn't get my driver's license until I was in my early 30s. So I tried it a couple of times as a teen. Didn't work for me, didn't click, didn't come back to my early 30s. And I already had kids by then, so you can imagine it was interesting. But when I overcame that struggle, it was such an amazing moment. I'm smiling from ear to ear in my driver's license photo. I look like I won the lottery. So the thing is, it's not necessarily about the word. It's, again, about how we position the word. I mean, if struggling is something that we all do, if as teachers we show that we're struggling, if as school library professionals we show that we have struggles, why is it bad to struggle? Are we all automatically at the top of the mountain? No, we're all struggling on our way up, and that's okay. I feel like it's healthier to teach young people that it's okay to struggle, to, ask for support when you're struggling. But for me, the most important concern with removing kind of more weighted words like struggling from this kind of discourse is that we know from the research I've done, and I've done substantial research in this space as well, quantitative research across all of Australia that has looked at resourcing for struggling literacy learners, and it is below what it should be. Teachers really, really have a struggle at working with these literacy learners in mainstream contexts because they're not getting the support that they need. They're not getting the resources we need. So if we call them the elephant learners or the purple learners or whatever, we are also reducing the impetus for those who are making these resourcing decisions to be responsive to the needs of the struggling group. We need to admit that they are struggling. They're not where they need to be. So you need to invest in them. We need extra resourcing, we need extra staffing, we need extra time so that we can meet their needs and help them to get to where they need to be, which is at the top of that mountain, their own mountain of individual attainment, not necessarily the same mountain as the person next to them. They know what their academic, social, vocational goals are, and we need to help them to get to that point where they've got functional proficiency and then support them beyond that to where they want to go. So this is the thing. I mean, we can argue about nomenclature all day long, but the most important thing is that the resourcing is given to the individuals that need it most.
Well, and you're right, because if we sugarcoat it, all of a sudden it seems less scary. I love, it was clear that you do not share a fondness of literacy tests or the practice of schools purchasing programs, nice little boxed programs to somehow fix our struggling literacy learners. You seem to have some strong feelings about this idea that you can package a solution that's going to work in a building.
The most outrageous thing about these solutions is that they really ignore the fact that educators, whether they be in the library or in the classroom, know that students have different needs. So even a student who's a struggling literacy learner will usually have more than one factor that is leading to that being the case. So the most obvious example is if you have a student who's a struggling literacy learner because they have dyslexia, but they also have a very high rate of absenteeism, so they're just not at school. Even if you buy the most amazing thing in the world to work with their dyslexia and you're really on top of evidence-based solutions in that area, if they're literally not at school, it's not going to change their literacy levels at all. So you need to take a multifaceted solution with those kinds of students, with all students. There are almost no circumstances where you'll be teaching a class where every single student has exactly the same barriers to their literacy performance. So where you're going to look for a one-size-fits-all solution and pay a pile of money for that, it's very unlikely to be effective. Then, we've got school libraries that are being underutilised. Even where lessons are timetabled in, students are still not being taken to the library during that time because when literally anything else comes up in the curriculum to compete with that, the school library is just kind of like a fun add-on thing that we just do when, we're just putting the students somewhere so teachers can mark or whatever. It's not acceptable because we've got these great resources. And we also have school library professionals who in many cases are very well equipped to support struggling literacy learners. In a less threatening environment, they can have a one-on-one in the stacks with a student and find out what kinds of books they like. They can have a one-on-one in the stacks with a student and connect them with the interest, but also make sure that reading level is where it needs to be so it's challenging but not impossible to access. Or maybe an audio book needs to be provided as an adjunct to the physical book to facilitate that student's reading. And that can all be done very quietly, very considerately, without the rest of the students, zooming in on this support that's being given. And, school library professionals are very, very sneaky in a good way. They're so beautifully subtle in dealing with these students who don't want to necessarily have their vulnerabilities projected in front of the whole class. So there's a lot that you do in this space.
Well, and I know that also speaks to our ability to build our collections in such a way that we are able to excite our readers at all different age groups in a way that doesn't make anybody feel sort of outed by the books that they're choosing. And that takes time. And the better we know our students, the more likely we are that we are going to be able to match those interests with books that we are able to provide in our collections. There are more than a few listeners who have found TikTok to be an incredibly useful platform in our profession, but also as a support when we're building out our collections. You recently studied trends on TikTok and applied what you saw to drawing connections between student reading, engagement, and well-being. And I'm hoping that you could give listeners just a little peek into what you were learning when you were on TikTok, because I understand in order to be on TikTok, you had to create a sort of a separate profile, separate from yourself as a person. Is that right?
Yes, and because otherwise I actually already had a TikTok account. If I kept my current TikTok account, the algorithm that I've already kind of earned through my clicks and engagement would shape what I was being exposed to. So I created a separate TikTok account, went on there and collected data, basically looked at, I think it was 116 videos produced by, young book talkers, where they're encouraging young people to read books and also just engaging with books. So my key interest was, as social influencers, we are, trying to meet young people where they are when we make book recommendations. And I appreciate, Amy, that you've said you've already got people coming into your library wanting to read that latest viral book on TikTok, and you know what it is, so you can connect them with it. But also what's really interesting is that the way they recommend books to each other is not necessarily how we would do it as an older generation. And the hooks that they consider to be pertinent might not necessarily be what we consider. So, for example, when we, make a display based around genre, obviously that's going to be useful for students who, understand their genre preferences. But we also have students that just really want to read a book that's going to make them cry. And they are on a book talk in the comments saying, oh, I went through 7 boxes of tissues on this one. It's amazing. And you're looking at that thinking, really? Amazing? You sound like you'd be like an Egyptian mummy at the end of that with not a single bit of moisture left in your body. How are you not in a hospital on an IV? There's that kind of sense of, this point of connection with books being really emotion driven in a lot of avid readers. And I guess if you think back to yourself when you were younger, that might have been a motivation point for you, or it might still be a motivation point for you as an adult, but it really did strongly emerge in the book talk data as that sense of wanting to feel someone else's absolute pathos and agony. And that then sent me off looking at the research on, is that then dangerous? Like, how does that work from a wellbeing perspective? If young people are, deliberately selecting books that are going to make them weep and weep and weep for days, is that okay to recommend from a wellbeing perspective? And I found that actually, yes, some researchers were talking about the catharsis of engaging yourself in someone else's suffering, that building of empathy and perspective taking. And that when you're feeling the pain and suffering of others, it gives you a bit of divorce and perspective from your own struggles in life and can actually help you to develop the fortitude to deal with your own challenges. So from a wellbeing perspective, it is possible that could be one of the things that is attracting young people to these books that will give a very strong sad emotion. I shouldn't say depressive because it's not the same thing, but that really strong sad emotion that they deliberately will go out to seek. And I found that really fascinating. Also, these great book talks that are being made of, journeys through books. So if you read this book, here are the kinds of landscapes you'll be encountering, or here's the kinds of characters you'll be encountering. And, you could build displays around, what kind of journey will this book take you on? And you've got desert here and spaceship there. And, thinking about that, traveling through reading, which is one of the connection points that young people are raising. They do such a great job of marketing books to each other. Really, it's such an inspiration if you're involved in Young People's Readers Advisory at all, to go in there and take a look at how they do it. It's so inspiring, and will give you some different ideas about how you can.
No, I agree. And I'm just, for me, I just feel like it is such a window into what so many of our students are seeing themselves. And it gives us that opportunity. It's such a cheat for me. It's a very easy way to spend money and know that those books are going to fly off the shelf. Because I think, when you look at our jobs in building our collections, you want to make sure that you're being the best custodian of the budget that you've been handed, and to do so in a way where that, nobody promotes books better than their peers. And it doesn't matter how much we like the book. If they're popular on Book Talk, all of a sudden that is a title that they want to read. And I'm grateful that you see the value in that, because I know for a lot of us that seems like a very obvious and easy way to make sure that we're using our money well. Dr. Merga, in Chapter 6, Librarians Creating Environments for Reading and Wellbeing, you explore how our space has the potential to support our students. And I'm hoping that you can go into a little more detail about how our spaces can support our students' well-being, because I don't know if that's something that we always focus on as librarians.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like the time is absolutely right for these kinds of conversations, because in terms of even before the pandemic came along, we saw issues emerging on an international level around the kinds of mental health challenges that young people are facing. And, it's really concerning. And then with the stressors of the pandemic, we really need to make sure that schools are spaces that really do go out of their way to support young people's health and well-being. And obviously we know some of you right now will be working in a school where you personally don't feel that safe and comfortable and supported. And, those sorts of environments do translate. So sometimes the school library is the only really safe, comfortable place within a turbulent school environment. We also know that some students will be particularly in need of having that sanctuary. But my research in this space that's reported on in the book that you mentioned is that kind of found that all students can find some benefit. So when we think about the library, we often think about the little bookworm kind of snuggled away in the corner with their nose buried in a book. But the research found that, the kinds of students that really celebrated using the library were really diverse. So, for example, we had the sporty student in there talking about how, on every really hot day, there was no question, just an immediate beeline to the library, finding a comfy spot in the corner, playing a quiet game with a friend or picking up, a book in a series that he's reading and just enjoying that space. And, he was not the typical bookworm type student at all, but he understood it wasn't just the space. It was also the custodian of the space, the school library professional. When people talked about the space, these children never divorced what you do from what that space offered. They understood that you make that library a safe space. So even underfunded school libraries that didn't have the same comfy furnishings, when they had that big-hearted school library professional that would listen to them without judgment. I mean, one student was talking about ranting at her school library professional about all the problems going on in her life and how she loved that the school library professional wouldn't offer solutions, but just listen and allow her to kind of get it off her chest. And then at the end, she would kind of be able to see the right path forward. Now, obviously, we're not qualified counsellors, but what we can be is a warm and supportive ear for students who are often facing challenges that we might not even be able to imagine in their home environments.
I know there are a lot of librarians who have been called upon to be an added support to our students who are going through particular trying times. And I know that that's something that has happened over many years, being asked to support our students who are grappling with a lot of life's challenges. And we are another set of another adult in their lives who is going to be invested emotionally in how they're doing day in and day out. And I think that's why so many of us love the opportunity that we have this to work with all of our students in our building. Dr. Merga, you are an absolute joy. I am so selfishly grateful that we were able to make this happen. I can't wait to share this conversation. Would you let us know, Are you on social media? Is there a way where we can follow you? Have you abandoned library Twitter? Are you still in a place where we can see you day in and day out? Or, and again, I'm grateful for the articles you've included in our show notes because I want to read all of them.
Thank you so much, Amy. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. For those who want to track me down online, the easiest place to follow me, I still am on Twitter, but I'm also on LinkedIn if people want to connect with me there. I'm always happy to expand my library community on there because I'm relatively new to LinkedIn and I hardly know anyone. So I feel like the loser at the party, kind of hanging around in the corner, clutching the cup of cordial, looking around nervously, hoping that she'll make friends. So feel free to make friends with me on LinkedIn. And just thanks for this opportunity to talk with you. Your passion for school libraries really came through, and it was a real pleasure to have this opportunity to kind of share ideas with you and also learn a little bit more about what's happening in your context.
Dr. Merga, I wish you a very happy holiday and happy New Year. It's coming. It's right around the corner. And I look forward to our paths crossing in the future.
Friends, I still marvel at the conversation I was selfishly able to have with Dr. Merga during this busiest of holiday seasons, especially when you realize that, number one, we had never met each other, and number two, we were half a world away. She was in the beginning of her day, 8 o'clock in the morning, and I was in the previous night, 7 p.m. at night, and it truly takes a certain amount of understanding and patience to be able to schedule something like this. And I am so grateful that Dr. Merga was able to join us. If you found this episode helpful, please share it out with your team, your PLN, and on social media. Be sure to follow on your favorite podcatcher so you'll never miss an episode. And if you really like listening today, consider leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews help others find us. One last friendly reminder, friends, I encourage you to take advantage of Capstone's generous $20 discount off an order of $100 or more using the code UNITED. The topic of our next and last episode of 2022 will be posted on December 16th, and the topic of supporting rural librarians and my conversation with Heather Perkinson. I hope you will tune in.